Okay, and we are live. So, welcome everyone to the happy hour on March 27th. So, let's just go ahead and dive in and catch me up on your writing projects.
Well, actually, it's been really interesting few weeks. After I got my edits back from Joelle, I don't know if I really talked to you since then.
Not really, no.
Or shared that, but I think she did a really good job.
Good, yay.
I was really happy with it. She was really critical and made some good points. And when I looked at it, I was like, yeah, she's right. So I couldn't argue with anything. And
that's the worst part, right? Because you're like, surely she's wrong. She must be wrong.
I know. And I was like, well, no, actually, she was right. So I did something I've never done before. So I dissected my whole novel.
Yeah.
I, took apart every scene to look at what was happening in the scenes and what the characters were doing. I went back and revisited all my characters, and I constructed an interview of 50 questions,
nice.
Which I asked each character. I did a profile so that I could really understand what was motivating them, and how I could use that in my scenes.
I'm curious, what was the one thing that was maybe most unexpected that you learned about your character? Because you've spent a year and a half with this book?
Yeah.
So what was the one thing where you were maybe most like, well, I didn't know that?
You know what? It was like they were neighbors, not really family.
Okay. Yeah.
I hadn't explored them to the depth of really understanding what makes them tick. I just had them doing these things like, and my evil puppets, moving through the theme. And I realized that actually it could be so much more, there could be so much more impact and adventure if I could understand these characters and how they could really interact together. And so it changed my story. It changed it quite a bit, actually.
Do you think you'd be willing to share some of those questions with other people?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Because I think that might be an interesting thing for people to see, like, here's an example of one thing that I use. And, what I find is every person does this differently. So, some people spend a ton of time before they start their manuscript and they're doing character interviews like you do. I do a lot of journal entries for my characters, which is kind of that same process. Like I just want to be in their head for a period of time. So I'm kind of writing, diary entries from different points in their life. So I do that exercise we talked about. It may have been last time, but that exercise around kind of what's their backstory and what's their lifeline and major events. I don't know if you can hear my dog hacking something up.
Yeah. It's like something's going on.
Yeah. Thanks for that ambiance, Gimlet. So, once I kind of had the list of like, these are the major events, then I kind of went back and did just sort of like a diary entry from, kind of maybe the day after that event or the night of that event, and try and just think like, how did they feel about it? And then even sometimes 1 year after that event.
Ooh, that would be good too.
Yeah, because I think, whenever something traumatic has happened or you're going through a difficult time, there's the getting through it stage.
Yeah.
Which you see with one lens. And then, I believe, if you get through that period of time, there is, again, a different lens, right? And so you have a little bit of distance from it. Or the other thing that may be interesting, particularly since some of your characters are younger people, is imagine their mom writing a journal entry about, what does she think of how they're coping or how they're doing, or, does she feel like that in fact is useful for them, or, kind of, I think, people who are outside the situation see it differently. And so they may be telling you things like, you may think you're falling apart, but they're saying, no, you're doing great. You're doing, so how their mom might see them would be a very kind of interesting take on that.
Yeah.
So are you now rewriting?
I am. I've moved on now. So I just started this week. And it was really, I had to like put on restraints, because my tendency was just to go back, just to write, like to
Yeah.
get an idea, just go to write. And I thought, well, like, where's that going to go? No, need to make sure all these things are connected so that I've got it thought out to the end. And that's a way of working that's new for me. And I will take that forward, because I can see where it saves so much time.
Yeah.
And it's much more, I think it's much more interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
But I like that idea of writing a journal entry from the parent or even from the character.
Or grandpa's point of view, or, that might be a really interesting one for that character, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Oh,
your videos. Yep, someone else is chiming in. I'm not sure you should. Hello, are you leaving your video off on purpose?
No. Okay. Although I don't want to scare you, I haven't looked in the mirror for an hour. Anything could have happened.
Things are scary that way.
There you go. Look at the hair. Anyway, I'm just lurking, so carry on with whatever you were doing.
We're just talking about kind of getting to know your characters, and especially when you're in that revision round. So you've now kind of maybe have a draft and you think that you know them. And Cynthia was using the term, which I thought was great, which I'm totally going to steal. And I may or may not give you credit, Cynthia. Knowing your character like a neighbor versus family. So she's feeling like she's getting to know them better as a family. So that is a useful process. And I wanted to share, I don't think people know Susan Lundell. I don't know if anyone knows her. She's working on a fantastic novel. It's a big, giant Viking epic taking place in the time of Eric the Red and all these things. And one of the things that she recently did in a revision round that we talked about that she was finding really, really helpful was, in fact, she kind of wrote down all the different scenes and then used a highlighter. So the romantic subplot she put in blue, certain characters she put in other colors, and then sort of laid it out and could sort of visually see. So one of the pieces of feedback that I had given her was I felt like certain stories just disappeared, which, given that she's writing a very long epic novel that takes place, over 70 years and, through fjords and various sundry things, stuff was getting kind of dropped. And so for her, it was a way of seeing like, oh, there's a lot of space between these two blue sections.
That can happen even in a simpler novel than.
Oh yeah.
A great. Yeah.
Oh, I could do it in a short story. So stay tuned. So yeah, but it certainly is easy to do, but it can be, again, I think what we're trying to find is ways of tricking ourselves to catch things, because when we have been in a novel, particularly for a long period of time, you don't see things anymore. It's sort of like when you have somebody coming over to your house and suddenly, you look around and you think, how have we lived like this? How did I not notice all the junk on the dining room table, or, the fact that the baseboards haven't been apparently dusted since, Hoover was in office, or, those kinds of things. Yeah, no peeking. Those things that you may not notice when you sit with it, but, fresh eyes can sometimes see. So that is a really good way of doing that. So did you want to catch us up on how your project is going?
Me?
Yeah.
Or
yes. We heard Cynthia did revisions, so she is knee deep in it.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually just trying to lever myself back into working on a project that it was almost complete before I set it aside to, work on polishing and releasing other books. And it's probably been a couple of years since I paid any attention to it. And I know I'm missing the last chapter or so. And in the meantime, I've decided I need a second point of view because my hero is kind of a cardboard cutout, actually. So I want to flesh it out. And that's forced me to ask questions about who he is. and his backstory and motivation and things that I kind of skipped over before because I was so focused on the heroine. So this is actually very topical for me to, just to be thinking about. That's really what I need to get back into the story, is to remind myself how it all went, but to remind myself what I was sort of thinking about when I created him, but didn't bother to put on the page. So, yeah.
Well, we'll see. Cynthia says she will share, but she made a list of interview questions for her character that she found really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're up for that, I will share that, and that may be something that helps you as well as you're kind of fleshing him out, because motivation is huge, right? And if you don't really nail that down, it becomes very difficult. And the biggest reason being, if you're doing your job correctly, you're going to put your character through hell. And normal people quit, right? They, when things get bad, you just don't do that thing anymore. So you have to give people a reason, what is it about them that makes them persevere? And sometimes that's easy because, if they don't keep trying, then an asteroid's going to destroy the Earth. And that's, a really good motivator. But if there isn't an asteroid crashing into the planet, then you need to find something else that will drive them forward when, again, normal people would stop or back away. Most of us do not like conflict. Most of us do not like being uncomfortable. So if things become uncomfortable in those things, then most of us will stop that activity. So figuring out what will keep your character pushing through, whether that's in an emotional way, so putting themselves at risk emotionally, or whether that's some kind of physical risk or danger that they're taking on, some kind of adventure that they would do. And you can certainly look at, tons of books to get examples of that. And in fact, that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. But before I do, did either of you have any specific questions you wanted me to tackle?
I did not. I didn't formulate a question.
That is fine.
Okay.
I'm sort of halfway through Mary Buckham's webinar class on 11 male archetypes.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with that. Although I kind of know where I'm headed, I thought that might be useful for me to flesh out my hero, because just to get some ideas for what sort of character, backstory, motivation, behaviors, strengths and weaknesses bundled in ways that make sense. I think, and the reason I'm sifting a bit is because my hero is a kind of a quiet character. And what you were saying just now was very relevant, because he's a guy who's tended to choose the comfortable, easy way out. And he's about to do that again until he meets my heroine, who is an extremely uncomfortable person to be around. And she just shakes up his world. And the easiest thing for him would be to say, I just can't deal with you, and walk away. And he almost does at one point. And then he comes back. So I need to really make it clear what it is that makes her so compelling for him, that he's willing to stir up his own comfortable, smoothed out life because he can't help himself. That's
I will actually look up, because Mary Butler, she also does, I think that she has a few books on those archetypes as well.
Might have. I've only done sort of occasional workshop with her, Buckham, not any books of hers. So I don't know.
I will do a look. There is definitely a book on the different character archetypes, and I no doubt I have it, because I have 6,000 craft books. Whenever I can't write a book, I just buy another craft book. So
I just bought 4 today.
I have a whole little stack sitting right here, in fact, right now. But it is a really good, I think there's one, and again, I'll find it, but I think it's heroes and villains and major archetypes. And it can be a useful way of sort of thinking. And I know I have mentioned this before, but I think it's really relevant to bring it up when we're talking about motivation, that we know that human motivation is either a push or a pull. And that's a way of saying that either something is so amazing that you will be pulled towards it, even though it is difficult and painful, or you have something that pushes you. That is, that where you are is becoming so uncomfortable that you will have to make that change, and or some combination of pushing and pulling. So the example that I've used before is I said, everyone imagine for a minute that I'm taking you on a field trip to Simon & Schuster and their office in New York City. And if you've ever been, it's on the 78th floor of Rockefeller Plaza.
Ooh.
Oh yeah, it's nice.
Yeah.
So, we're going to imagine that we take a nice little tour of the office and everyone loves it. We're meeting people and they invite us to go up. And if you go to the 107th floor, there's a rooftop deck on top of Rockefeller Plaza. And you can see all the way to Staten Island. Like, it's all of Manhattan is below you. And it's New York. So there's another building that is probably about 6 feet away from the roof line. So I want you to imagine that we're at the top, we're at 107 stories up, and I say to people, that other building is really only 6 feet away. Like, you could jump that. That is a jumpable distance. Right? Does anybody want to try? And I'm guessing most sane people will say, no, I do not wish to try. Although whenever I do this with high school students, there's always at least 3 or 4 boys who raise their hand and say, I'd do it, which is proof that boys are stupid. But most young women will not. So, but if I said to everybody, well, actually, I didn't want to say anything, but the building is on fire. And the fire has already caught to the stairwells, so we can't get back down. And the fire trucks, obviously the ladders don't go up 107 stories. So our options are we jump or we're going to die. That's a push, because I'm willing to bet with probably very little disagreement, most people are going to give it a shot. Like, if that is where we're at, if it's like this building is on fire, and in fact, that's some of the behavior you saw during 9/11, is people just doing whatever they could, right? Even though that was not particularly a great option. So you will see people make that try. So that's an example of a very dramatic example of a push. The opposite would be, of course, a pull, which, as I said, for whatever reason, Simon & Schuster is a bunch of, sociopaths, and they have put a $1 million book contract on the other roof. And the first person willing to go over there and get it can have that $1 million book contract. Now, there'll be a lot more people that might hesitate and say, no, I'm still not going to do that. But there'd actually be more people who would be like, that is my dream come true. I'm going to give it a shot. And there will be people who would try and make that leap. So that's kind of an overly dramatic example again but the push-pull. So when I'm asking a character to take a leap of some sort, to take a leap of faith, to take a leap emotionally, to take some kind of risk, to do something scary or dangerous, I ask myself, am I pushing them or pulling them? And which is going to be the more effective, or is there a combination of those things that will somehow do that? So it might be that they're suddenly imagining themselves, as a very different person. And you see that a lot in rom-coms, where you have a heroine and she's talked about things that she's wanted to do in her life. And then suddenly her fiance abandons her at the front of the altar and she is now bereft. And so that's a push. So her world is turned upside down. She thought she was getting married in 10 minutes and now she's been left at the, altar. And then a friend will call and say, do you want to do a home exchange with my apartment in Paris? And so, someone who's been afraid and who hasn't been willing to take a leap will suddenly, that combination of being pushed and pulled. So she's like, screw it, I'm going to Paris, and then you're off on this rom-com adventure of her, no doubt, meeting a stunningly handsome Frenchman and starting all over again, and things that she wouldn't have been able to do had that combination of a push-pull not happened. So I think what I was going to talk about actually dovetails really nicely with this. I don't know if people have ever read this book. If I can get it up.
Oh yeah, I love that. Yeah.
It's called Reading as a Writer. And I'll post a link to it when I do the notes up tomorrow for today's session. I find it really helpful, and I've had this book for a while, and it was interesting to kind of go back through it. But I think we forget how much we can learn from other books and other stories and dissecting those stories. So, if you have Netflix on, recently some girlfriends and I rented The Holiday. I don't know if people have seen that one with Kate Winslet and Jude Law and Cameron Diaz. And, it's interesting to...
Jack Black.
It's really an interesting story to, it's just a fun movie to watch and a fun escapist movie if you want a good girls movie. But it's also interesting to sort of break down, like, what is happening for each of that characters. What is the growth arc that Cameron Diaz has to make? So she's this hugely successful movie trailer maker. She has this amazing house. She has all this going for her. But if you remember the story, she can't cry. And she has this sort of block, and then you go on the other side and you have Kate Winslet's character who's in love with this guy who's a total schmuck. And, he keeps her on the thing. And so then there becomes this inciting incident. So you can start taking that story and pulling it apart and trying to figure out, how does she get those characters to take on or do something that is frightening for them? What things do they misunderstand because of their worldview? So again, I don't know if you remember, but Cameron Diaz meets Jude Law, which is lovely. And, she thinks he's quite the player, and she hears him taking these phone calls from, I can't remember their names, but say, Megan and Miranda or whatever. And she's assuming like, oh, those are his other lovers. And then it turns out it's these small daughters that he has. But you can kind of see the way the characters were set up and what their motivation is and what their expectations are of other people drives their actions. So one thing I have done for years, because I'm weird, and why not join me in that, is to actually, if there is a book that is maybe similar to what you're hoping to write, or is one of your favorites kind of just in that genre, is to spend a lot of time really reading it like a writer. And I actually did this before I even had read this book. But one of the things that I remember doing is I sat down and read the Da Vinci Code. So my mother-in-law had recommended this book to me. And I read it, I think, like in 2.5 hours. It was one of those things where I sat down and just flew through the book. And I remember thinking like, oh, it's really good. So I thought, well, I'm going to read it again. And of course, the second time I was reading it much slower. And I realized, like, no, actually, it's not that good of a book at all. But what he had done so incredibly well was pacing and tension. And that's his shtick. Like, let's be honest, the guy's, good on him. He sold 6 bazillion copies of his books, like, more power to him. But his dialogue is clunky as hell. His characters are flat. His info dump galore. His, romances are about as sexy as white bread. But pacing and tension, the man nails it. So that was the first book I remember doing this with. But I actually got out index cards. I am the queen of the index cards. And I wrote an index card for every single chapter. And I would put on the top of the index card, chapter 1. And then I would list who is in that chapter. So what characters show up in that chapter. I would often list like when or where that chapter took place. So Cynthia's house, Fernie, March. And then just bullet points, like what are the major things that happen in that chapter? Like, why does that chapter exist? And then once I had that, next index card, chapter 2, taking place at Eileen's house, North Vancouver, still March, and then again, bullet point list of what is happening in that chapter. And just starting to look at how that plays out. And how is the story being structured? And when are characters showing up and when are they disappearing? When are subplots coming up and when are they being resolved? And you hear sometimes different rules about these things, but I don't think there has to be any set rule as much as understanding the mechanics. And there's choices, right? And we all know there's lots of examples of fan fiction, right? So people who are rewriting the Harry Potter series from Hermione's point of view, or they're, making it an erotica novel. So stay tuned. People, take a story in a different direction, but clearly the author made specific choices. And it's really useful to spend some time thinking about why they might have made those choices. So I think this is useful for me as well. I don't know if other people don't do this, obviously, with library books, but if you have books that you own, I don't know if people are margin makers, but if there's a passage that you really like, consider underlining it. And if that really freaks you out, maybe just underline it lightly in pencil, or put a sticky note on that particular page. The other thing I do try to make a note with, and again, if it's my own book, I actually make a mark on the page, but if it's a library book, I just put a Post-it note in there to go back and look at when I'm done. Have you ever had the experience where you're laying in bed and you're like, as soon as I finish this chapter, I'm going to bed? And then you get to the end of the chapter and you're like, no, one more chapter is just fine, right? Go back when you're not reading it for the first time and just diving through that and figure out why. Like, what question did that author raise at the end of that chapter? What did they do that made you feel like, I have to read, like, just at least a couple pages more, right? And I find that, kind of going back and dissecting that can be hugely helpful in understanding what you might want to do then in your own book. Or if you have a book, and you're writing a romance, for example, and if there's a romance novel you can think of where you truly fell in love with that hero or heroine, like, why? Like, what was it? Because it's not that he was a tall and strapping Scotsman with muscles rippling and a too short kilt. Like, most likely that's not enough to really get you going. It's something that character says or does that made you have that little kind of squishy moment where you felt like, I think I'm actually falling in love with that character. Or again, if there's a point in a book where you find yourself crying, or tearing up or thinking about it, again, just make a note so you can go back to it later. Don't try and do this as you're reading the book the first time, because you'll just ruin the story for yourself. Trust me on this. So, do it as you're going back and doing it, but spending sort of some time trying to figure out, how did they do that? Because it seems like magic. And I would actually use that example really well. I don't know if people ever watch, there's a show by Penn and Teller where they bring on different magicians, and it's called Fool Us, right? And so these magicians come on and they try and fool Penn and Teller with the trick. And what's interesting to me is, of course, Penn and Teller know what to look for, which is all sleight of hand, right? In most cases, what most magicians are doing is they're saying, look over here, while over here is where what they're actually doing. They're sliding something into a pocket, or they're making a movement with something and something's swifting around. So trying to understand that. And that's what magicians do, right? Is they're watching other magicians to see, how did they pull off that trick? How did they make the person believe that the bunny got pulled out of the hat? Where did the bunny actually come from? Because it wasn't in the hat, right? So doing that with another writer's work is another way to replicate or to add that trick to your own arsenal, even though, again, that may not be something, you're not going to do it the exact same way, but you're going to notice, oh, they did this thing, and that just made me feel so bad for her when that happened, that I then was cheering for her extra hard to do that. I had a really great conversation with my college roommate is in town currently, and we've been having late night long talks and various things, and talking about various stories and books that we love, and talking about how everything matters. So if you're describing something, then there should be a reason for that. So, you know, sometimes I'll read manuscripts and people will have these beautiful descriptions of, I was reading one today, and it was this wonderful description of this French restaurant that these two characters were in. And I cannot fault the author at all. They were pulling in all the senses were there. So I could tell you the color of the tablecloths and what the rose petals looked like as they fell onto the tablecloth, and the smell in the air of butter and garlic and all these various things. But I found myself skimming it. And then, of course, since I'm editing it, I need to go back and pay more attention. So I went back and tried to figure out, like, why am I skimming it? And the truth is, because why do I care? You know, it's a French restaurant. Really, if you had said that, I probably could have come up with a mental image that would have been just as good. So the interesting thing for me is, how does the character interact with that? You know, is it a character who's looking down and seeing, you know, 4 forks and 3 spoons and 7 knives, and having that moment of, like, I'm about to make an ass out of myself because I don't know which one of these is a fish fork or a fish knife. When, you know, you don't want to be that person who, like, drinks the finger bowl, you know, like, you don't want to be that person. But that tells me then something about the character and adds to the tone of the scene. You know, if you're telling me what they wear, you know, what piece of information are you giving me? So if you tell me, it's a middle-aged woman wearing Land's End cardigan with a matching shirt underneath, what does that add to the character? Like, if I already know she's a suburban mom, have you added anything to it? Now, if underneath the cardigan, buttoned up where I can't see it, she has a death metal t-shirt, that tells me something about the character, right? Like, I wouldn't have expected to see that or know that. So I think it can be interesting. So hang on, I was going to find out of this book a section for you guys. Reading glasses because I am old. What? Yes, I am.
It's relative.
I just wear glasses because, you know, it makes me look older.
Trying to go for that mature look. That's it exactly. So I'm going to read you 2 different sections from this book. If I can keep my earplug in here. So the author says, in the ongoing process of becoming a writer, I read and reread the authors I most love. I read for pleasure first, but also more analytically, conscious of style and diction, how sentences are formed and information is being conveyed, how the writer was structuring a plot, creating characters, employing detail and dialogue. And as I wrote, I discovered that writing, like reading, is done one word at a time, one punctuation mark at a time. It requires what a friend calls, and I love this line, what a friend calls putting every word on trial for its life. Changing an adjective, cutting a phrase, removing a comma, and then putting that comma back in. So I just really quite love that section. And I just think it's delightful. So let me find another here. So in this, they're actually talking about actors, but she's talking about a playwright, and they're preparing this play for production. And in this particular chapter, she's talking about even gestures. So I'm often on people like, you need to be using show me your character, show me the scene. Don't just have people talking, tell me, is he picking at his clothes and so forth. But this I just thought was such a lovely example of that. The economy with gesture reveals the prickly consciousness of social class reminds me of a story I heard about a German theater troupe. They were rehearsing a scene in which the boss was supposed to hand a document to a worker in the plant. The actor who was playing the worker kept saying he couldn't get the scene right, that something felt incorrect about the way he was doing it. At which point the director called into the theater the cleaning woman. Very politely he said, "We're having a problem. Can you help us and hold this document for a moment?" The cleaning woman then wiped her hands on her apron and only then reached for the paper, demonstrating to the actor exactly what had been missing and what was required. So I love that, because I do think it is that perfect example of how a small gesture conveys so much. And again, we wouldn't think of it, but when you hear that, like when you have the idea of this worker or a plant worker taking something from someone who would be their superior and their boss, they would have that moment.
It's someone who's not accustomed to handling paper for a living. So there's this whole other relationship with office work.
And I don't want to smudge it and I don't want to ruin it. And, so thinking if, you have two characters meeting for the first time, how are they acting in front of each other? And what are the gestures that they might be making? And how is that reflected in that? I thought that was powerful. And then I want to give just one more example. So in this chapter, she's talking about voice and about how it's not just what you're describing, but how you describe it. So this actually comes from the novel Les Divorces. And it's about a character, that's Diane Johnson. It's about a character who has shown up in Paris. And so we all, can think about Paris and, there are certain cliches and it would be very easy to just plunk those cliches in. But I'm going to read this section from the book from you. I suppose because I went to film school, I think of my story as a film. In a film, this part would be under the credits, opening with an establishing shot from a high angle, perhaps the Eiffel Tower, panning the tiny scenes far below the foreign city, life as watched from the wrong end of a telescope. Closer up, the places identified by cliches of Frenchness, people carrying long baguettes of bread, old men wearing berets, women walking poodles, buses, flower stalls, those Art Nouveau entrances to the metro that seem to beckon to another region of vice and art, but in fact lead to an efficient transportation system. That contradiction perhaps a clue to the French themselves. Then, in a series of close shots, we become aware that some of the people we are seeing are not French, that among all the Gaelic bustle are many Americans. Far from their native land, their flavor changes ever so slightly as they absorb new perfumes, just as the slightly toxic chemistry of Americans abroad erodes, just a little, the new place in which they find themselves. Which just makes me want to reread this book because I have read it before, but it's been a long time. But just think of how much is packed into, that's a 2-paragraph section that I read to you, and not even particularly a very long 2 paragraphs. But we're understanding that this character went to film school. And in fact, how she sees things is by that idea of almost directing, right? Yeah, she's moving this around, right? And she's going in and she's pulling back and she's picking up, again, those little cliches. And she calls them cliches, right? Like, the guy with the baguette and the beret and the person, walking with their little tiny poodle. But then she also gives, I think, these kind of sharp contradictions. Like I really like the line, those Art Nouveau entrances to the metro that seem to beckon to another region of vice and art, but in fact lead to an efficient transportation system. The contradiction perhaps a clue to the French themselves. That tells me a lot about how she sees this and sees that world. So the voice,
little editorials slipped in there.
Yeah,
right?
like it's just a time, like you could easily be like, you know, the French are this weird combination of having all this beautiful stuff, but at the same time, they do this other stuff really well, blah, blah. But she doesn't tell us that. Like, she just has this one tiny, beautiful, beautiful line. That, again, if you've ever had the luxury of going to Paris, like, as soon as she said it, I could picture the metro signs with their beautiful Art Nouveau sort of curly cues. And it looks like it should be this spectacular, magical place, but you take 3 steps down and it's all subway tiles and kiosks and, you know, that kind of things. But it works, right? And it is that interesting thing, as all of Europe is, I think, of that mix of beauty and functionality, which is just so lovely. So what I really wanted to challenge people with this week was the idea of starting to read more like a writer. You know, as particularly if you find yourself struggling and it feels like, you know, I'm not making any headway with this book, pulling a book that is not that you're trying to rewrite that same book, but it's like, if I could write a book like this, or this is the kind of feel that I wanted to have. And that's a useful school to understand anyway, just because someday if you're trying to market your book, you want to be able to say, if you liked A and B, you might also like my book. So understanding, why is that? What is it about A and B that is also in your book? Is it tone? Is it short sentences? Is it kind of a snarky, you know, underbelly, or is it tension? Like, this is a book, like, if you like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, you'll love this book. And you can see that in a lot of ways, that's not the same. Like, I would say I definitely want my book with Malice. I wanted it to have tension and all of those things. But I wouldn't ever compare it to Dan Brown, apart from the fact that I think I read better characters than Dan Brown. Small aside on that. But other than that, it's also the idea that that's not the kind of tension that I was going for. Like, I really wanted to do more of a Patricia Highsmith kind of psychological tension feel to it. Or often when I was comparing it to, people said, you know, what's it like? I would say, if you liked the podcast Serial, the first season of Serial, you'll probably like my book, because I wanted to go, and again, that's a very different art form, but when I listened to that podcast, what fascinated me was I listened to the first episode and I was like, that poor kid, he was racially profiled, the cops went after him, he's innocent. And then I listened to the second episode, which is from a different person's point of view, talking about the same crime. And I was like, that little bastard killed that girl. And then I listened to the third episode and it was like, well, wait a minute. If this third person is telling the truth, then either the first guy or the second guy have to be lying, because all 3 of these things can't be. And that, for me, was what was so compelling about that podcast, was every time I felt like I had my finger on what was happening, I would get a new piece of information, which would then totally make me rethink the story. And I very consciously attempted to do that in With Malice. That, you know, you're getting one perspective from the main character, and then you hear a piece of information, and now you have to rethink that all over again around, you know, is she lying to herself? Is she, in fact, completely out to lunch on this? Any of those kinds of things. So
and there's so many so many different ways to create tension, and they feel different.
Yes.
I'm about 2/3 of the way through State of Wonder by Ann Patchett.
Yes.
And it's all tension, although every little mundane thing that happens is just the next logical thing, and it's no big deal, and there's not a lot of action, although she does ultimately make it to the Amazon jungle from Minnesota. But it's all like small little logical things, and it's written in a kind of quiet voice. But the entire book, you're on the edge of your seat, because you're like, you know, you're about to discover something unexpected or horrible, and you know what it is.
Something wicked.
I don't know anything. 2/3 of the way through, right?
But what would be interesting, and again, never do this the first time you read the book, because I truly do think it can ruin. And I went through a period of time where I actually found it really hard to read, because I was over analyzing absolutely everything that I read. So now I'm much better. I just read a book. And then if it's a book that I truly love, I go back and I look at those passages and I think to myself, what is on this page that's making me feel tense? Like she's describing a dinner party. No one's trying to kill someone else. No one's backstabbing someone else. Like, what are the word choices? And again, you know, last time we all met all together, we were talking about specific word choices. And, you know, so maybe instead of someone walking across the room, he, you know, creeps across the room or he slinks across the room. And that just slightly changes the feel and the, versus if he ambles, like it's a very different tone and feel. And I think too often we don't think of that in our own writing. We're just communicating a story. But so much more of the story is happening on those kind of secondary and third levels.
Yeah. Without actually trying to analyze it, a couple of things as I've been reading this book have jumped out at me. And they're almost like throwaway pieces of information that undermine or contradict or add an element of something sinister. And it's almost like if you're not really paying attention, you don't see it. You just feel the effects of it. Yeah.
It's sort of like if you've ever been out at a dinner party or whatever, and you start to have a feeling that the couple that you're with has been having a fight before they came to dinner. And there's just small words or, you know, a reaction, like, you know, he reaches for something and she moves just slightly away. And you start getting that feeling like, even though no one is saying, like, we had this huge fight before we came to dinner, you're picking up on something between these two characters is wrong. Or certainly we may have had that in our own relationship where you're with someone and you have that feeling like something is not right here. There's something going on. And taking time to really figure out how did that other author do that is hugely helpful. And, you know, again, if they're your books, the beauty is one, you don't have to return them to the library. But, you know, I have a lot of books on my shelf that are stuffed with Post-it notes. And, it, you know, it makes it easy to go back because I'll be like, how did she, you know, build that thing up in that scene? And I can just kind of go right to that page. Or if you do a lot of ebooks, this is very easy because you can bookmark and make notes and then search by them, which is a lovely piece of technology. And a way, again, to just sort of break that down and do it. Now, I do want to put one caveat in because I know I've done this myself, and so it's a warning to others. The more you start to think about this stuff, the more you can drive yourself crazy when you're writing.
Yeah, you can become constipated.
Yes. Where you stop yourself and you're like, wait, is he walking? Is he ambling? Maybe he should shuffle. No, he's not going to shuffle. He's going to saunter. No, not saunter. Delete, delete, delete. And, you know, you start like, just get it in, get it down. This is the real meat that comes for me in revisions. And it's sometimes I think for newer writers, it's the discouraging part of revisions because you feel like I've done so much work already and now there's more work to do. But I don't think you can do that more work until you do the earlier work. Right? Yeah. You have to do that all together. So
one thing I put into my new sort of way of working was to get down to that level of detail, like what is the mood in the scene and what I even put down for each scene some keywords which I wanted to try to help me sort of frame what's going on. So it might be, you know, dark magic, or, you know, like I put in words that would trigger for me what I was hoping to achieve. And then I just kept going back to that. I would write something. I'd be like, no, that doesn't really sync with what, with this sort of feeling I want to come through without saying, you know, there's some dark magic in this room.
Yeah. But like when you have that, like when you say dark magic, I start thinking of like, what colors I might point out are in the room, or, you know, a heaviness, or just, you know, you start thinking of things that are going to evoke that sense or that feeling. The other thing that I find helpful is, and I've downloaded tons of it, is you can download soundtracks to movies. Mm-hmm. And this is an art and a science. Like any soundtrack for a movie is designed to evoke certain emotional impacts. So if you are writing a scene, like you want to have, like Cynthia, a madcap adventure scene where they're racing through the tomb to find something, put on the Indiana Jones, dun 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 dun, and have it playing while you're writing, because it's that feeling of like, yeah, like that's the, you know, the cadence that I want to have. That's the feel I want to have. And particularly because a lot of soundtracks are music scores only, like they're not necessarily even songs with words. Songs with words makes me sing along, which is not always a useful process to my writing. But, you know, the musical scores, or you love the movie, you know, of course I can't think of a single one at this moment, but, you know.
I do this with my writing, but some that I really like are the Cirque du Soleil soundtracks.
Yes.
Because they're full of energy. Yeah. The energy is off the chart, and it goes always, you know, there's stuff where you could just imagine that, yeah, exactly. And then, you know, boom, and it changes tempo and you're on to something else. Those are really fun to write too.
So you can make actual like emotional playlists. Like I have playlists that are like sad, joyful, rage, action, right? And, you know, you can sort of, you know, put that out like, okay, I'm writing a scene, and the feel in the scene, I want to be that passionate, longing kind of thing. And well, think of some of your favorite movies that have those scenes, download those songs and play them in a loop while you're writing. It can sort of help set that tone for you. All right, we are almost out of time. So a couple things. I will post in the notes a link to Reading Like a Writer. I do think it's well worth a read for people. It's really quite a good book, and you can dip in and out of it. If it's one of those books you don't have to read cover to cover unless you're like that. I will also find somewhere on my craft shelf the book of character archetypes, because I think that can be really helpful, again, if you're designing characters, to sort of know what those are.
Yeah.
A heads up for people. So next week, office hours, which would normally be Tuesday morning, will be Monday morning. And that is because I'm on a plane Tuesday morning and therefore wouldn't be there.
So the calendar automatically updates that?
Yeah, it should automatically update that. I'm going in this week to make sure it has done that, but it should be doing that. And then also that should also let you know the week after, I'm actually on the Surrey cruise has a writing cruise, and I'm teaching on that for a week. So I will not have office hours that week. But I will be available by email. So if people have some burning crafty questions, you can send those to me, and I would be more than happy to answer them. But I'm not counting on having reliable Wi-Fi on the cruise ship, because I have been led to believe I may not have that.
That is going to be fun.
Yeah, I hope so. Yes. I think it's going to be hard not to be fun. It's writing on a cruise ship. So that's my theory on that. All right. So
okay.
I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I'm going to stop the recording here.